Hi everyone, this is a mini lecture on punctuation. It's very selective. We're only focusing on commas, semicolons, and colons because my teaching experience tells me that those are the three punctuation marks that most people have trouble with consistently. There's just a lot of confusion about what these different marks do. For example, a lot of people believe that you use a comma in a sentence where you would need to pause or maybe even take a breath if you're reading the sentence out loud. And that's not really accurate. There may be times when commas are sprinkled in for that reason. And in fact, if you're familiar with musical notation, you know that in an example of sheet music, you might see something that looks just like a comma that does in fact indicate where you should take a breath if you are singing words. But in writing, a comma doesn't really do that. So we're going to start with commas, look at semicolons, look at colons, look at a few examples, and hopefully this will illuminate some principles for you. The most important thing that commas do is they help writers and readers avoid confusion. They are punctuation in general is really a system of signs. I mean, just like road signs that if we're writing, we can use to communicate with readers to let them know which direction to go, whether to stop, whether to slow down, what have you. So that's, if you remember nothing else about commas, just remember that you should use them when there's a possibility of a lot of ambiguity. You're never going to eliminate ambiguity in your writing because you can't stand over your reader's shoulder and let them know what it was that you quote-unquote really meant. But commas do help us avoid at least some of that. So what I mean specifically by that is basically three things. First, that commas are useful for setting off non-essential information. That is, information that's not essential to the grammar of the sentence itself or the completion of the sentence itself. If you need a review of that, look back at the mini lecture on clauses and sentences. But it may be information that's still desirable, useful, adds something. So you see this example right here. The writing course which I was required to take was extremely useful. You can get rid of that middle part right here, which I was required to take. And the stuff around that, the writing course was extremely useful, is a complete sentence. But you add this in because for some reason you want it there. You want to let someone know, oh, by the way, I was required to take this, even though I didn't really want to. But it turns out it was still extremely useful. You use commas to separate that, to set that off, to signal to a reader that this which clause is not grammatically necessary to completing the sentence, but it adds some information. A counterexample is this one. The writing course that is required for all students is one you should sign up for now. The reason the middle clause that is required for all students in this case is not set off by commas is the writer wants to signal to you that he or she is letting you know about a specific writing course. So there may be a whole lot of writing courses out there that you might take. The one I'm talking about is specifically the writing course that is required for all students and not another writing course. Hopefully that makes sense. That's what I mean by essential versus non-essential information. Commas set off non-essential information, like this oh by the way statement, but commas do not set off this. And as a matter of fact, it's a good rule of thumb. If you have a question whether what you're telling someone is essential or non-essential in a sentence, if you would feel yourself saying something like, oh by the way, that's non-essential information, okay? Another thing commas do is set off introductory expressions in many cases. So in this example, you might see this on an airplane. In case of a loss of cabin pressure, comma, oxygen masks will drop from the ceiling. If you didn't have that comma in there, you might introduce a little bit of ambiguity. In case of a loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks, wait a minute, are they oxygen masks, or are we talking about in case of a loss of oxygen, the masks will drop from the ceiling? So you can eventually figure it out. It's just that it's going to take a reader longer to figure out, longer to parse the sentence, if you will, than if you had the comma right there. That's going to help the reader out a lot. So that's why the comma is there. In this next sentence, you don't really need it. The phrase in 2013 is an introductory phrase, but you can probably leave the comma out. And we can stick it in, and it's fine. If you do that, you know, you're not going to make any enemies or anything, but you can just as easily leave it out, okay? And then the last, in many ways, the most boring use of a comma is to separate out into a series. You already know that. I'm not going to show you an example. If you have to go to the store to buy bread, milk, chocolate, diapers, matches, and a toaster oven, you're going to separate those things in a series. Okay, so you already knew that. Semicolon. That's what it looks like. It looks like a cross between a period and a comma, right? And you should keep that in mind. It looks like that for a reason. Where a comma, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute, where a comma is often not strong enough to make certain separations in the middle of a sentence, and where a period is the strongest thing you can do to separate two main clauses, a semicolon is exactly in between. It's stronger than a comma, but not quite as strong as a period, so that's why it looks the way it does. A semicolon can separate main clauses if you think they shouldn't be separated with a period. I'll show you an example of this in just a minute. You can always put a semicolon in between main clauses, and it's going to be grammatically appropriate. You might want to use a semicolon between main clauses if you would rather not use a period, if you want to suggest a clearer relationship between the main clauses than a period would signify. A period's a pretty hard break. As a matter of fact, British usually call a period a full stop to signify that it's like holding up a stop sign. A semicolon is kind of like a yield sign, if you want to continue the metaphor that way. Okay? Maybe another way to separate main clauses is with a comma plus a coordinating conjunction, and, but, or, nor, for, so, and yet. You can separate main clauses that way, but you may not want to. So a semicolon is another option. You can also use a semicolon, and should use a semicolon, if you are listing a series and the items in the series already have internal commas. So here's a good example. I visited Fargo, North Dakota, Dayton, Ohio, and Fayetteville, North Carolina. If we used commas to separate this, there might be some ambiguity. You're like, wait a minute. Did you visit like 3 places or did you visit 6? Right? Now we can, most of us probably know that Fargo is a city in North Dakota, Dayton is a city in Ohio, and Fayetteville is a city in North Carolina. That's my hometown, by the way. So that's why I know it. But it's, again, some ambiguity. So if you use these semicolons here, that very clearly indicates that we have items in a series that already have internal commas. Okay. The colon. A colon can separate two main clauses. So sometimes you will find a grammar book that uses a semicolon and a colon interchangeably. They're not exactly interchangeable. Conventionally, you use a colon to separate two main clauses if the second clause exemplifies, further explains the first one. Okay? So in this example, it's probably appropriate to use a colon. I can't stand parking a car on this campus. Colon. There's not enough space. So this main clause, there's not enough space, further exemplifies or further explains the main clause that comes before the colon. So you could use a semicolon there, but a colon is entirely appropriate, and in fact it signals to the reader that more's coming. In other words, I've let you know that I can't stand parking a car on this campus, but you might be wondering why exactly I can't stand parking. And so after the colon, I tell you. Okay? A colon also, you probably already know this, introduces a list or a series, but, and this is kind of a pet peeve for a lot of people, including me, you want to make sure that the introductory clause, that is the clause before the colon, is itself a main clause, that it is, in other words, a grammatically complete clause. It could stand on its own as a sentence. So, there are several ways to get to campus: by car, by bus, by train, by bike, or even on foot. The stuff that comes before the colon is a main clause. It could easily stand on its own as a sentence. Okay? In this example, and I see this a lot, this is not appropriate. There are several ways to get to campus, including car, bus, train, bike, or walking. In this case, you don't actually need a colon. You can get rid of it. And you should, in fact. Okay? So you don't use a colon in this case. Now, here's some examples of some of the difference. What are the differences? What you see here is two sentences. There are two main clauses, and I've chosen to punctuate them as two sentences. That's entirely grammatically appropriate for me to do. It's finally gotten warmer. I'm biking to campus. No problem with that whatsoever. You won't find a teacher who marks that up for grammar. However, you might want to suggest a closer relationship between these two clauses. Okay, so you've got several options. Here's one option a lot of people use sometimes. It's finally gotten warmer, comma, I'm biking to campus. There's a problem with that. That's why I have the asterisks right here. What you've done here is create a comma splice or a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence occurs when you have at least two main clauses that are not separated by appropriate punctuation. Remember what I was saying before about the semicolon, that it does a little bit heavier lifting than the comma does, that a comma is not a particularly strong way to separate items in a sentence. And this is a good illustration of that. In this case, the comma cannot act on its own. If you just stick the comma in there to try to separate these two main clauses, you've committed a grammatical error that is going to raise all kinds of hackles among many of your faculty members and instructors. So don't do that. All right? You can, however, use a comma as long as you use one of the coordinating conjunctions. In this case, I've chosen so. Why have I chosen so? I could have put in and, but so suggests some nuance that and doesn't suggest. It's finally gotten warmer, so I'm biking to campus. What so suggests is that there is a cause and effect relationship between the first clause and the second clause. Okay? I could also use a semicolon. It's finally gotten warmer. I'm biking to campus. Now, I stuck in the therefore here to show you that I could put therefore after the semicolon. Or I could write consequently or as a result or something like that. Okay? I don't have to do it, but if I want to, I can. In other words, it's a stylistic choice that I have. If I do use a word like therefore after the semicolon, I do need to put a comma after therefore. Okay? But I could just take it out. And I think what happens when I just use a semicolon is, I've suggested that there is a closer relationship between these two main clauses than a period would signify. A semicolon is not a very common option to use in a situation like this, but it is depending on who you want to impress, you might want to use a semicolon. So just another option that you have. And then there's a colon. I think there are different opinions about whether the colon is appropriate here. I'm not entirely sure that it is. You can use one, and again, depending on the grammar book that you would pull off the shelf in the library or a bookstore or wherever, you might see that a colon is fine in this situation. You might see that it's not fine in this situation. But what I want you to see is that with the exception of the sentence that has the asterisks in front of it, all of these are grammatically correct sentences. Okay? The difference is just a matter of style. It's a matter of personal preference. It's a matter of your own developing writing style. And there's really no definite advice I can give you about choosing one of these over another. It's just a matter of experimenting with experience. So what's the exercise? This one's a bit different from the previous exercises. You're turning in the first summary of an academic argument this coming week, right? So what I would like you to do is, just very briefly, at the end of your summary, type a quick note that explains your choice of punctuation in one of the sentences in your own summary. So write the summary, look back, pick a sentence that has commas or semicolons or colons in it, and then do a quick analysis of it. At the end of your summary, give me a brief sentence that explains why you used commas, why you used semicolon, why you used colon in that sentence. Okay? That gives me a little bit of a glimpse into whether you understood what I just told you in this mini lecture and how it is you're thinking about punctuation in your writing to signal things to your readers. Okay? Again, as always, if you have questions about any of this, let me know, and I will go ahead and post this basic guide to Canvas, so look for that.